Hey guys, Josie from Queen My Pawn. Today we'll be examining how to apply those patterns that we learned in the previous video with King and Queen versus King to checkmate the enemy king in 2 moves. And so I've made 7 positions that we'll be going over. Of course, before every position, I'll let you pause the video for 3 seconds and I'll count it down. So here we have a basic checkmate in 2. And in every single video, we actually aren't learning any new patterns unless there isn't a queen, in which case I'll talk about it a little bit more. But in every position where there's a queen, we've pretty much learned the same pattern, and I'll elaborate more on that. To give you a hint, though, you always want to get the queen in front of the king's face whenever possible, because when you do that, the king has to go backward, but most of the time well, actually all the time, I actually have some pre-workout powder on my mouth. When you try to push the king back and it doesn't have anywhere to go back because it's on the edge, it's checkmate. So that's how these things are going to work. So now you know what was on my mouth. Pre-workout powder, because I'm going to go work out after this. Working out is important. So 3 seconds to pause the video and try to find how to do that in this position. Okay, so we know that if you want to get the queen in front of the king's face, we need to push the queen onto g7. That traps the king. 2 problems, though, is that the queen isn't protected on g7, and the queen cannot hop over a knight because the queen is not a knight. And knights don't hop diagonal. So how do we get the queen onto g7? A simple answer might be queen to g5, but the problem is that would be stalemate. And also, the queen will not be protected on g7. So there's actually a 2-step maneuver, and that's why it's called checkmate in 2. We need to control g7 first. Once we control g7, that means that we have to put 2 pieces to control that square. So one piece protects the other when it moves. Knight to h5. The king has to go either to the left or to the right, which is exactly what happens. And in either case, the queen moves in front of the king, and it's checkmate. So the knight and the queen control g7. One of the pieces will move there. The other one protects. That's how you use coordination. Good job. Chapter 2, or the second puzzle. So again, the king finds itself trapped. And I won't give any hints until after the video, until after the 3-second counter. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. So here are the hints. The king is trapped, and it cannot actually go anywhere south because there's a knight preventing that. Now, something else important is that this king is preventing any it's a barrier. So the king right here forms a barrier, and so the black king cannot go towards the left or towards the g file, and this knight prevents any escape. So if we could just get a knight to check the king, it will be checkmate. Now, how can we do that? Well, we know that this knight should come over here and check the king, but that gives up control of g7. I mean h7. It gives up control of this square h7. That's not what I meant to do. So we'll pretend that never happened. That would give up control of that square, but the good thing is we have 2 knights. And when we move one knight to f6, that one now controls h7. Black moves their pawn because it's the only move that they have. And then we just move the other knight to check. Now the king cannot escape south because it's trapped. The knight is controlling f7. Now there's another checkmate in this position. And actually it is interesting if you can find it. So I'll give you 3 seconds to find it. So the other checkmate is you check the king anyways. And even though it does escape to h7, you should see in this position that this knight controls h8 and h6. And so the king can only escape this way. Well, at that point, you just bring in the bishop in. And that would be a checkmate. This knight didn't even play a role. So it's as if this knight didn't exist. So we could even pretend the knight on h5 isn't there. But I think the knight's there to prove a point. You need to control h7. And the pawn has to move. And then the other knight just checks. Okay. So another 3 seconds to pause the video and try to find the answer. Now in this position, we have a queen. And with queens, you usually get the queen right in front of the king. But this might be an exception because there's no way to do such a thing. The knight would have to control g2 on the next move. And that's just not going to happen. We would get the queen there to checkmate. But it's unprotected, and there's no easy way to protect it. This would be a stalemate. King to f3 will control g2, but the black king has no moves and has no other pieces to move or pawns, so it's stalemate, and both sides win, which is not what we want. But we create a barrier. Now, notice that the king is preventing escape towards the left, towards the f file. And this queen is controlling this as well. So we move the queen right there to h3. The king moves to g1. And notice that this is a barrier that we formed with the king and the queen. And the queen controls everything else. So all we have to do is give a check with knight to f3. And this is a typical checkmate with a knight and a queen. It cannot escape this way to f2 because the king is there. This position looks similar. Knight to f3. However, the king can escape to g3. And that's the difference that makes the difference. Here's another one with a bishop this time. 3 seconds to pause the video and find the answer. So the thing about bishops and queens is that the bishop should control one color square and the queen should control the other color. This is also known as Bowden's mate. So if we Google Bowden's mate right now, you'll see that one bishop controls one diagonal and the other bishop controls the other diagonal. A bishop can also be a queen in this position. 2 crisscrossing diagonals. Easily, we know that these crisscrossing diagonals are now controlled. And the king cannot run up because there's a barrier. I should put this in red. So there's a barrier and the king cannot go that way because of the queen. It has to go south, and there's only one square because the king controls this. That's very good. Notice that this now becomes a back rank checkmate. The king controls b2, and the bishop controls the light squares a2 and c2. All we have to do is deliver a back rank checkmate with queen to e1. Chapter 5. Okay, so it looks like the pawn's about to promote. But this is actually another 3 seconds for me to pause the video and have a chance for you to try it out. So this is actually a basic pattern that we learned in the first video. And the kings are in front of each other. All we got to do is get the queen to f2 ASAP. And that starts with queen takes a2. The king moves left or right, and it doesn't matter which way, because then you just put the queen right in front of the king, and that's the basic checkmate pattern. When the kings are at a knight's distance, just put a queen right in front of the enemy, and it's checkmate. 3 seconds to pause the video and try it out. So in this position, we should note that we have a few pieces. Now, here is something to always remember. Imagine the queen on d3. So the queen moves from f1 to d3. Now, that's like the queen is trapping the king, and the king is checkmated. It cannot go anywhere left or right, but of course that means that it goes towards the back, which is what we want. You want to trap the king onto the back. So the queen goes to d3. Now, good thing for the king that there's an edge here. When the queen goes to d3, the king is forced to the left or to the right, backward. And in either case, if we can find a checkmate there, we should be golden. Notice that when the queen goes to d3 and the king goes to c1, that's an easy checkmate. The queen in front of the king is always a common pattern to remember. But what about when the queen checks the king and the king goes to e1? Now this is also an interesting checkmating pattern, and this occurs often in middle games. What do I mean? After knight to c2, I mean that there's usually a pawn, a enemy pawn, like of the same color as the enemy, that blocks the king's escape. Or the king is on the edge. For example, if we imagine that this is the edge of the board and there's nothing here, this usually happens to a castled black king or a castled white king. So like the black knight and the black queen checkmates the white king because it has nowhere to go. This happens often, and it's something to remember as well. The queen controls the light squares and the knight controls the dark squares. So just like that, it's checkmate. And finally, we have a tricky one, a rook and a bishop. How do you coordinate these? 3 seconds to pause the video and find the answer. So in this situation, if it was black to move, the simple, well, black to move is forced king to b1. Then the simple rook to d1 double checkmate would suffice, but it's not our move. Normally a waiting move such as rook to d8 is played so that king to b1 is forced, and then you just slide the rook back down to d1, checkmate. The problem though is that there's a bishop on f5, and that prevents king to b1. So you try to move the bishop out the way to such as g6, but then they move their pawn and nothing is accomplished. However, you can still create a checkmating pattern after protecting the rook on d1 and just moving it there. If the rook were to be protected on d1, the king doesn't have anywhere to escape to. And that's how we do it with bishop to g4. Now the king is forced to b1, and you just slide down the rook to d1. If they try to move their pawn, the checkmating pattern still exists. And the king cannot escape this way because of the barrier that the white king forms. And it's almost as if the black king being on the edge is a recipe for disaster. But we already know these checkmating patterns. Some of them, the ones that we don't know, such as the ones over here, are all about creating barriers. we created a barrier on chapter 6. We created a barrier on chapter 7 and on chapter 2 as well. Especially on chapter 7, there's a barrier to notice. It cannot go north or towards the second rank. That's how you know that you have checkmate in 2 moves. I hope you enjoyed the video.